government leadership, industrial policy, and economic plan to a post-carbon economy is absolutely the answer for the problems that we are facing. It's the answer not just for meeting our emission targets, it's the answer for making life affordable. It's the answer for making work conditions better.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and research director at the Broadbent Institute. Like we've spoken about in previous episodes, Canada is lagging behind on industrial policy. That is, the proactive, government-led development of industries geared towards economic growth and transformation. It's necessary for the fight against climate change, as Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood and Brendan Haley have pointed out in previous conversations, and it's something that's used all the time in massive, advanced capitalist economies like the United States and Europe, as well as in China and throughout Canadian history. The appearance of government intervention would seem at odds with the ideology of neoliberal capitalism, something we've also talked about on previous episodes of the show, that looks to commodify more aspects of life in the economy, retrench government services, and ultimately remove government intervention and let the invisible hand guide the market. As some look to the death or the ghosts or zombification of neoliberalism, might there still be a role for industrial policy in the Canadian economy after neoliberalism? Did industrial policy ever really die in Canada, and does it actually live on in ways ordinary Canadians don't quite see or understand at the moment? So to help us understand this present moment, we chat with political economist D.T. Cochrane. D.T. Cochrane is a senior economist at the Canadian Labour Congress and friend of the program who comments regularly on industrial policy and capitalism. D.T., thank you for joining us on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So some critics and even cheerleaders of industrial policy make it out to seem like a radical policy idea meant to further merge states and markets in a way that seems blasphemous to the secularism of laissez-faire capitalism. But just what is industrial strategy or policy exactly? And is it all that radical? Is this such a departure from neoliberal capitalism?
I'm going to start by shifting our terms a little bit from the relationship between states and markets and talk about the relationship between businesses and government, because I argue that the state encompasses both government and business. And what we're wanting to understand is the role that government plays within the economy that includes relationships between businesses, relationship between governments and businesses, and relationships between individuals or households and businesses. The orthodox conception is that government that governs best governs least. And so the government is really supposed to remain sort of at the periphery of the economy and sweep up any market failures. Anywhere that we don't get appropriate levels of market provisioning, that's the role for the government. So the most radical expression of this is libertarianism that says there's no role for government, that markets can always do what needs to be done to properly, effectively, efficiently allocate resources. The more orthodox perspective is that government's role is to provide public goods that some would want to limit to the military and public safety. Others will even adopt a slightly broader conception of what government can do to include things like healthcare, because they will see, we see market failures in areas like healthcare and education. So that is a role for government. But this is an inappropriate understanding of what the relationship between governments and businesses actually are. For businesses to function, even in business-to-business relationships, business-to-consumer relationships, market relationships, government is essential. Government creates the rules that allows these things to take place. The late, great political economist Karl Polanyi, in his work, The Great Transformation, explained in detail that historically there have never been markets without governance. So this idea behind neoliberalism, which is that government should retreat and retreat and retreat and leave markets to function as they're supposed to through the competitive mechanism, one of the terms used to describe that was deregulation. And it captured a certain idea that was important, but it was somewhat of a misnomer because deregulation is always re-regulation because markets have to be governed. So what we call deregulation was really a shift in regulation to favor businesses. And it was a shift in regulation that sometimes completely abdicated regulation to businesses themselves. And we've especially seen this with the rise of the digital economy, where you have massive multi-billion-dollar marketplaces that are completely beholden to privately held platforms. Think about the App Store for Apple. Apple completely governs that. Think about Amazon Marketplace. Amazon completely governs that. So all that we've done is abdicated a form of democratically accountable governance to a form of governance that's only accountable to its shareholders. Now, what industrial policy seeks to do is recognize this essential governance role for government institutions, which currently are public institutions, accountable democratically. It puts it back in the driver's seat to orient and direct our economy where it needs to go. In the process, it really creates the bedrock on which markets can now function. It can provide greater certainty for every economic participant, including businesses. So that's what we need industrial policy for, is to point us in a direction. The economist Mariana Mazzucato refers to the mission-oriented economy, and I think that's a really good term to describe what we need right now. What's our mission? What is it that we're trying to achieve? We can't just leave the economy to the market because it's not going to get us where we need to go. Where do we need to go, and how can we mobilize resources to that end? That requires our democratically accountable public institutions that exist under the auspice of government.
You speak about industry and the economy needing a bit of direction. It's not necessarily to put it on a single track, but to point it to where it needs to go. And I think this actually ties into my next question with regards to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's legacy. At the time of recording, earlier this week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced his resignation. But in that decade since becoming Prime Minister, I seem to recall earlier in his first administration, all of this fanfare around so-called superclusters. Very early on, it was the premier economic policy. I seem to recall everyone kind of making fun of the innovative word choice for this policy. And I feel like in the past decade, it's just been totally ignored and cast aside. But the idea of geographically concentrated industries is not new. I mean, you can look at places like Germany, where there are industrial heartlands. And even in the United States, you have industrial heartlands. Industrial heartlands being a directed way that the market should orient itself regarding geographic factors, supply chains, and what have you. It's not new and would appear to be something of industrial policy. What happened to these superclusters? Could they be considered industrial policy, and why exactly did this fizzle out?
So industrial policy is a phrase without a clear and obvious reference. So it can be used in a pretty loosey-goosey way. But the superclusters are a good example of the government's continual involvement in the economy. So as much as the ideology of neoliberalism was that government will retreat from the economy, the reality that economies, markets, businesses all need governance. And for the most part, the private sector wasn't ready, willing, and able to fully capture every form of governance because lots of them aren't profitable and they need this public institution to provide the governance. The government was still involved in the economy in all kinds of different ways. But because it was doing so under this ideology that it's supposed to retreat, it was almost ashamed of the role that it was necessarily playing in the economy. one of the shifts with the Trudeau government was removing some of that shame and saying, look, there are ways that we can get involved in the economy, but we're going to do so in a market-oriented, a market-friendly, a market-based way. And the superclusters are an example of that. So all of the funding for the superclusters was contingent on it being leveraged to get private sector buy-in as well. So it wasn't simply that government is going to lead, it's going to spend the money that's necessary to create these industries of the future, and then the private sector will be attracted to the economic activity that generates. It was involving the private sector right on the ground floor because of this market-oriented, market-based perspective, which says the private sector ultimately knows best. I saw a talk by Globe and Mail columnist Andrew Coyne in which he listed 24 maybe government programs with a whole jumble of different buzzy names that were all meant to describe the government's involvement in the economy. And so this was Coyne saying, for all of the talk of market-oriented economy, look at all of the ways the government is still meddling in the economy. And the solution is, and then just lays out the same tired solution. He just peddled for austerity one more time, all of its failures be damned. Let's just keep running at this wall. Eventually it will fall down. My perspective on it is that government is governing poorly. It's governing the economy poorly because it's doing so under this ideology that markets know best and this still somewhat shame-based involvement in the economy. And because it's not thinking about its involvement in the economy as an essential part of how economies function, you get all kinds of redundancies, you get all kinds of contradictions, mismatches between what economic participants need and what government is providing. You'll have departments working at odds with one another. So all we've really gotten out of neoliberalism, the policies that neoliberalism has brought in, is not less government involvement, it's just worse government involvement. We're not governing the economy effectively, we're governing it in a much more haphazard way.
And yeah, if we think about it like bad governance, I think this also brings to mind how industrial policy is also touted as something of a key tool for a green economic just transition. But many progressive economists have also pointed out that if neoliberal capitalism still forms the basis of climate change actions, that substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are just not all that profitable, i.e., this is likely what makes market-based solutions ineffective. Hence, you have your challenges of market-based mechanisms like carbon pricing. They haven't been super effective in stopping climate change. What should industrial policy that fights climate change actually then look like, given this misdirection from previous governments?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb, and when we talk about the ideology of neoliberalism, I'm going to say it's effectively dead, and we're shifting into a new form of capitalism. And I don't think this new form of capitalism is necessarily going to be better than the old form of capitalism. I think the election of Trump and the signals he's sending about how he intends to govern are really telling us that the post-neoliberal capitalism that we are entering into is going to be much more naked cronyism. And whatever the faults were with neoliberalism, it was a very rules-based order. The true believers in the ideology, not the people who touted the ideology because it served their specific interests, the people who really thought that if we just liberate markets, that's going to unleash all this economic dynamism and it's going to make everyone better off. They were rule makers. They wanted to set the rules that would then allow economies to function according to this utopian ideal that they had. And I don't want to pretend that, capitalists have always adhered by these rules and they kept everything in order. Absolutely, far be it. They're breaking rules left, right, and center all over the place. But having those rules in place as a norm was important. It did have some disciplinary function. It did keep things within certain bounds. And now the shackles are off. And what we are going to see with the naked cronyism, I don't think is going to be better than what we have had. However, it is also creating opportunities for other economic ideas, ones that have been marginalized for decades, to start expressing themselves again. We can start talking about things like industrial policy, which is really another term for economic planning. Because what we're talking about is the need for a plan. Now, planning has been the number one villain of orthodox economists for 40 years. They pointed to the Soviet Union, said, that's what planning is that what you want? But again, the reality is not that planning went away. Corporations plan all day long. What's happening in the C-suites is planning. What's happening at every level below is planning. For some reason, it's only apparently at the top level of the corporation that planning is still acceptable, when really what we need is to have an economic plan for transitioning. How are we going to actually achieve the transition that is needed? We're still dealing with the policies that were introduced under the ideology of neoliberalism. So as much as the ideology is dead, its policies are still in place, and they are going to be torn asunder in a very haphazard way, a way that will largely serve the cronies who currently have the favor of the most powerful people in the world. So Trump is threatening tariffs left, right, and center. Of course, one of the major targets of those tariffs is China. But we also know that his new best buddy, the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, is absolutely dependent on continuing to be able to produce Teslas in China. So I will not be surprised if we see some kind of trade sanctions directed at China that create loopholes that allow the Teslas of the world, Trump's cronies, to continue to make billions upon billions. And we're seeing a stream of billionaires all essentially go and bend the knee to Donald Trump because they're now wanting to curry his favor. But again, because the neoliberal near consensus is being torn asunder, alternative ideas coming from socialist voices, people who are advocating for a bigger role for government, are getting to have more say in what kinds of policies we're going to need, because this new post-neoliberal world is going to be extremely harmful on many, many people who are then going to be looking for different policies to actually ameliorate the harsh conditions that are coming in. And government leadership, industrial policy, and economic plan to a post-carbon economy is absolutely the answer for the problems that we are facing. It's the answer not just for meeting our emission targets, it's the answer for making life affordable. It's the answer for making work conditions better. Although I think we are moving into a post-neoliberal world, because the near consensus around markets know best with respect to economies is falling apart, the markets know best idea itself is still firmly entrenched within some very important institutions, not least being Department of Finance, the Liberal Party of Canada. So we're still going to have policy recommendations and governance that is informed by this notion that markets know best. The climate response of the Liberal government is really the best example of how the markets know best perspective informs policymaking and how it has failed us. So obviously the carbon tax is the big tentpole policy for the government's climate action. In Budget 2023, they offered this pyramid describing their climate action, which they explicitly described as market-based. And the base of the pyramid is pollution pricing. This is the foundation of their approach to dealing with the climate crisis, the most market-informed response. The next step up is investment tax credits. That is the next most market-based response. It's a way of allowing businesses to pay lower taxes for doing certain types of things like investing in clean hydrogen, investing in carbon capture. This is still very oriented towards business interests. It is a neoliberal approach to dealing with climate. Then the next stage is strategic finance, which includes Canada Infrastructure Bank. And then at the top, we have targeted programming. So this would be the direct spending on achieving some form of transition to a net zero economy. In my opinion, this pyramid needs to be turned completely on its head. We need direct investment as the foundation of our approach to the climate crisis. I think there is a place for the carbon tax because it is a way of putting a price on the emissions that for really over a century, we've just been freely disposing into the economy, which has benefited the people who've consumed the most fossil fuels. It's a very regressive type of subsidy. So a carbon tax is really a way of eliminating a subsidy, but it needed to be the top of the pyramid, not the bottom of the pyramid. Direct investment to get the country where it needs to go towards a post-carbon economy. That is the foundation of an actual just economy, not founding it on the carbon tax, which is a market-oriented response to the climate crisis. And we're seeing now how that's playing out politically, which many people predicted was going to be the outcome of basing your approach to the climate crisis on this policy as your tentpole.
So like real industrial policy is a complementary set of things like actual direct investment complemented by carbon taxation, pricing carbon. I can see why, if you completely base things on just one market mechanism that's regressive, something like, added value sales tax, people are going to flip and it's going to be bad for people and bad for the economy. But, they don't really seem to see that complementarity. But I also want to take it back to the Trump administration you were alluding to earlier and trade with China. We have Canada now once again facing somewhat chaotic and unpredictable policy horizons on international trade with the United States. What effect does this have then on Canada's industrial policy? Or on the flip side, could industrial policy be the key to limiting or even fighting back against the economic pain that's being planned in the next Trump administration?
So as we've already talked about, in many ways, industrial policy is still here, there, and everywhere. Government is involved in the economy in all kinds of different ways. Even investment tax credits could be considered a form of industrial policy. You're taking a specific type of investment activity and saying we're going to incentivize that by offering these tax benefits if you invest in these areas. Andrew Coyne's extensive list of all these government programs were examples of things that could reasonably be described as industrial policy. But what we're wanting is a coherent, all of government perspective on industrial policy that would make sure these small pieces cohere, that they fit together, that they're reasonable and rational, and they ensure our economy can weather storms like trade wars. If Trump follows through on his tariff threat, it will be horrendous for Canada. We have always been a very open economy. As much as the globalization debates of the 80s and 90s made it seem like free trade was a new thing, Canada is a very trade-based economy. We had access to a lot of resources, and exporting those resources was our path to development and becoming, a relatively wealthy country. we're still going to be dependent on that. And when protectionist barriers go up, it makes things more difficult for us, especially when our single largest trading partner targets us directly for punitive tariffs. The solution is one that we've been talking about ad nauseum, really since this country came into existence, diversifying our economy. We need to stop being what Harold Innis described as hewers of wood and haulers of water. We're a resource economy, a primary resource economy. We don't develop the resources at home. We don't move them up the chain to create more value, to actually get more of that wealth. We need to diversify the products that we're developing and exporting, producing here, sending around the world, and we need to diversify our trading partners. We have been saying this forever. It came up again with the free trade debates. It's coming back around, and we keep falling short of actually achieving this necessary diversification of our economy. And I will say markets, businesses are not going to get us there on their own. That's the role for government. Government, public institutions, democratically accountable institutions can be the ones to devise the map for getting us where we need to go. There will be missteps along the way. There always are. Failure is a part of risk-taking. The country needs to take risks in order to transform itself, to become net zero, to weather the storm of this potential trade war targeting us. We can take those risks because we have access to lots of resources, because we have a very educated workforce. We just need to make sure that the costs associated with them are borne fairly, starting with those who have them the most, and that the benefits when those risks pay off are distributed much more fairly. Again, we can't look to markets to achieve that fair end, to achieve that necessary transition, especially in a just way. We need public institutions in the form of government. At times, I feel like I'm being too flippant by sort of suggesting that this is the solution to every problem that we face. It won't be the same single government program that deals with these problems, but an approach that recognizes the power of our public institutions, the power of collective action that's democratically accountable. That is the answer to these problems. It's not an easy answer. There's lots of messy details that have to be worked out, but we have to utterly change the way we think about the relationship between governments and business, between governments and market relationships, between governments and the economy, in order to actually get us to a just, sustainable economy.
You could basically say, same thing that Harold Innis said about Canada's political economic development. What goes around comes around. Lastly, speaking of classical debates on Innisian political economy, we have a favorite publication of academics of that sort, Canadian Dimension. In Canadian Dimension last December, you wrote about how mainstream economists are misdiagnosing Canada's so-called productivity crisis when they don't talk about the distribution of productivity gains going to top families over the past 40 years or so. What do we need from industrial strategy to fix this productivity crisis?
So workers become more productive as they're equipped, as more investment is put into productive capacity, as new technologies allow more output for the same input, or the same amount of output for less input. The problem with past technological development is that often workers pay a disproportionate cost for these transformations. Take the Luddites. They have been really done dirty by history, the way that they're remembered. The term now basically means anti-technology. But the Luddites weren't anti-technology. They were anti-authoritarianism. They were anti having the technology imposed on them with no say in how that was going to come to be, and no protections or supports for the people who were losing their jobs from these new technologies. So understandably, still today, people are very hesitant about new technologies that threaten their jobs because they don't trust that there's going to be a safety net in place for them when and if that does happen. New technologies that are essentially labor-saving technologies are going to be enticing to businesses because they want to save on labor costs. They're supposed to bring in those new technologies in response to rising labor costs. The government allowed them to use a different strategy, allowed Canadian businesses to use a different strategy by importing precarious labor that they could pay lower wages, that they didn't have to provide with the sorts of benefits that domestic workers would expect, the sorts of wages that domestic workers had rightly come to expect. But instead of responding to rising labor costs at home by investing in labor-saving technologies, they were allowed to import this cheap, precarious labor, which was bad for all workers and best for the shareholders of these companies, and really has been a major factor in the waning gains in productivity in our economy. It might seem strange for a labor economist to be advocating for investment in labor-saving technologies, but those are what make us more productive. The other part of it needs to be support for the workers whose jobs are going away. And the emphasis also needs to be on jobs that aren't great jobs. They're jobs, so people who are desperate will want them. But if we ensure that people aren't taking jobs out of desperation, that they need this because otherwise they're going to end up on the street, they're going to end up hungry, they're not going to be able to support their families, then those kinds of crappy jobs that now you're having to offer higher and higher wages to try to entice people to take, those are the exact types of jobs that now there's an incentive to automate. Oh, if we automate this job, it will actually be cheaper than continually hiking wages to try to attract these workers to these onerous type jobs. But we're able to attract workers to these, less desirable jobs without offering higher wages because people are desperate, especially people from less privileged parts of the world. That then the government conveniently creates a program that facilitates the ability to exploit those workers who are very, very precarious when they're here. We need the kind of solidarity among workers. And one way that solidarity should be expressing itself is by capturing the public institutions to govern in the interest of the vast majority of Canadians who are workers or the dependent of a worker. Then we can get the kinds of investment that we actually need to increase productivity and ensure that the dynamic new industries that are developing can welcome the workers who are being dislocated from elsewhere. Again, I'm not going to pretend that this is easy. People don't like losing their familiar jobs, but there are ways of making these transitions easier for them, less costly for them, not having the costs so concentrated on the workers who are now losing their jobs, and then being told, oh, well, don't worry, there's a bunch of new jobs that are going to emerge. Sure, those might be in a different part of the country. Sure, those might be in industries for which you have no current relevant skills. Sure, those might actually be completely out of the country. Don't worry, the market will sort it out. No, we need a robust safety net, stronger employment insurance supports, stronger income supports of all kinds to make sure that those who are dislocated from these productivity enhancing technologies are actually able to make the transition into new, different other kinds of jobs.
DT, thank you for chatting with me on industrial policy after neoliberalism for the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was D.T. Cochrane, senior economist at the Canadian Labour Congress. And if you like this episode, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.